Thanks for listening to this archive of Teaching American History's special webinar for August 18th, 2020. This was the last in our three-part series on presidential elections and campaigns. What can we learn from history? The focus of this program was the election of 1980 between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. We were joined tonight by Dr. Jeff Sikkenga, Professor of Political Science at Ashland University and Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and Dr. Chris Burkett, also Professor of Political Science at Ashland University. Thanks for listening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center. So glad that you could be with us this evening for the third and last in our webinar series on historic presidential elections. This is sponsored by the Ashbrook Center with our partner, and a special thanks to our partner, Missouri Humanities, for co-hosting this event with us. They've been wonderful partners, and we're so delighted that they could be joining us and helping get the word out about this program. So thank you very much to Missouri Humanities and to all of you for joining us this evening. As many of you know, the Ashbrook Center is an independent educational center located at Ashland University in Ashland, Ohio. Our mission is to strengthen constitutional self-government by educating our fellow Americans in the history and principles of our country and in the habits of reflection and deliberation that are necessary for self-government. And we really think that this program is part of that mission. We think that you can learn from history. We think that you can study history, you can ask it questions, and you can listen for its responses. That history can give us some perspective on the issues, even the issues we face today. So we thought in this election year in 2020, why not look back at some historic and really defining presidential elections? In our first webinar, as many of you know who joined us, was on Thomas Jefferson and the election of 1800. We took a look back at that bitter contest between Jefferson and John Adams, what it meant for America at the time, and what lessons we could learn from that for our own times today. 1860, last week, Abraham Lincoln and that election. What it showed us about the character of Americans, what it showed us about the particular statesmanship of Abraham Lincoln, and what it meant for the country. And today we move to the third of those webinars, and that, of course, is Ronald Reagan and the election of 1980. We move into the 20th century, but many of the questions, many of the themes continue throughout, as we see, and as I'm sure we'll know from talking tonight. And that talk is going to be in the form of a conversation, because as always, at Ashbrook, we really believe that education is not about information. It's certainly not about indoctrination, but it's about thinking. It's about discovering the truth. You know, we really believe, as I've said before, in Aristotle's old maxim that all people by nature desire to know. And then we add, but they don't want to be told. And they want to discover it for themselves. And the way that we found you discover these truths best for yourselves is having a conversation with the past, having a conversation with each other, and thinking about these questions together. So delighted that you'll be joining us. Please, with your questions, as we have been so far in the series, send us your questions. I'll try to get to as many of those as I can. I apologize ahead of time if we can't get to all of them. There are always so many and so many good ones. But please do submit those, because we have a rare opportunity tonight to bring the past alive. Maybe the recent past for some of us, maybe the ancient past for some of us, but the election of 1980. And I'm joined for that conversation tonight with Dr. Christopher Burkett. Dr. Burkett is a professor of political science at Ashland University, and my colleague now for many years. Well, it's been many years, right, Chris?
Yes. I think we've reached the point of many. Yeah.
Many good years. Chris got his bachelor's degree from Ashland University, in fact, where I think he was a double major in history and, interestingly, in art. And is himself a really fine artist, and often gives talks to our students on art and art and politics and art and democracy, and the art that we see and the themes of democracy that we see not only in American art, but also in architecture, like the White House, the Capitol building, and many others. Really fascinating stuff. Chris is a trained historian, but also a trained artist, and brings those two together in really interesting ways. But when after that, he went on and got his, after working out in the real world for a number of years and earning a living, he decided for whatever weird reason to go back to graduate school and get his master's and doctorate from the Institute for Philosophic Studies at the University of Dallas, where he completed his PhD. Chris's dissertation and much of his scholarly work has actually centered on foreign policy in the American founding, and in particular, the really interesting question, what kind of foreign policy do the principles of the Declaration of Independence commit America to? And that was a robust debate about that at the time of our founding. And it's a debate, frankly, that has continued up until this day. And we see it even in the documents for tonight in the prominent place that foreign policy played in the debate between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter during that presidential election. Chris has been with us, as I said, for a number of years. He is the director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program, which is our honors program for students of history, government, and political economy here at the Ashbrook Center. He has been a part of our teacher programs from the very beginning. He teaches in our Masters of Arts in American History and Government program, a wonderful course on the Constitution and Constitutional Convention. He teaches in our Teaching American History programs. He's really taught just about everything on the American founding, American foreign policy, the presidency. And he and I share another thing in common, which is we are the students of a great mentor and great man himself, Peter Schramm, who passed away almost 5 years ago to the day, but was an executive director of the Ashbrook Center, a great influence on Chris as a student, and then later on me as a young faculty member. We learned at Peter's feet the importance of taking America seriously, taking American history seriously, and taking American politics and political thought seriously. So, Chris, thank you so much for joining me this evening for this kind of conversation.
It's a pleasure.
You know, you and I were talking about this, and you said something that kind of grabbed me when we were talking about this earlier today. And forgive me for saying this, but we've known each other a long time, so I feel like I can. You said that the presidential election of 1980 actually started in 1964, which is a strange claim, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
It's a little strange. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. So, you know, the election of 1980 has sometimes been referred to as the Reagan Revolution, and I think Reagan liked that way of thinking about it. But if it was a revolution, it wasn't a revolution in the sense that we often think of revolutions, where they're sort of, at least modern revolutions, where they're quick and bloody and over with, right? Sometimes revolutions take a long time to sort of grow and build and develop, and then finally come to fruition. And 1964, which was a pivotal year for Reagan and for the development of conservatism and the Republican Party, in many ways set the stage for the election of 1980. I don't want to go too far with this, but in many ways, the election of 1980 was essentially over many of the same issues that the election of 1964 was over. And Reagan was just getting into politics at that time in 1964. As you'll recall, Barry Goldwater is the Republican candidate running against Johnson, the incumbent. And at that time, conservatism as a political movement was just coming into its own. It was very young. The Republican Party itself was kind of a hodgepodge of various political groups that didn't necessarily, you know, what they had in common fundamentally was they didn't like Great Society liberalism, right? So you have libertarians, so-called neoconservatives who had been, former liberals mugged by reality, and a lot of different groups, but they hadn't quite coalesced to the point. So in many ways, the election of 1964 was important because it put certain ideas out there that could form the basis of a real kind of conservatism as a real viable political alternative to liberalism. And Ronald Reagan played a very large role in articulating what conservatism could be and what it could actually mean at a time when, and again, a lot of these various people that were very disaffected with Great Society liberalism were looking for an alternative, but they were searching for something that they would have in common. But by the way, of course, Barry Goldwater is running in 1964, and he loses, right? Spoiler alert, in case nobody knew that. But Barry Goldwater didn't lose the election in '64 because he was the wrong candidate. He was a very good candidate. He was a very solid conservative candidate. The main reason he lost was because conservatism at that time was an idea that was sort of ahead of its time. It was still gelling. It hadn't become quite as popular or widespread a movement at the time. And so Reagan, again, playing the pivotal role that he did, was very important in his support of Goldwater. In that in supporting Goldwater, he articulated certain fundamental things that became really the heart of conservatism that could unite these various groups of people together in the Republican Party. So, for example, libertarians, they liked Goldwater because of his anti-big government rhetoric, right? But they didn't necessarily like the rest of what Goldwater was doing. Neoconservatives liked his hard stance against communism and foreign policy, but not necessarily everything else. What Reagan contributed to the conversation was the idea that conservatism stands for certain things. And that conversation Reagan began that conversation in 1964 and continued that all the way through his political career as governor of California from 67 to 75, I believe. And then even after he was governor of California, I'm not sure if people know this, Reagan had a daily radio commentary, sort of like for those of us who remember Paul Harvey, right? When Paul Harvey would come on every day at 12:30 or something, and he would say, something quick, and then I'll be back with the rest of the story. Well, Reagan did that for 4 years, and he would begin every day by saying something like, "Do you know what your government's up to? This is Ronald Reagan. I'll be right back." They do a commercial and come back, and he would every day for 4 years give a very nicely written, clear, articulate account of some problem in government or some principled idea that he wanted to put forward. And the cumulative effect of this is, I think, and again, I might be overstating this, but Reagan had the effect of really shaping what you might call the conservative mind over the course of those nearly 20 years, culminating in, of course, the election of 1980.
Right, but it's not smooth sailing simply, right, for Reagan, because he backs Goldwater, and you gave us a document to look at, his famous speech, "A Time for Choosing," in which he says, in an era where the Great Society is just coming into being, it looks like liberalism in its modern form in the Democratic Party is ascendant. The Democrats control Congress, they control the presidency. The idea of conservative attacks on this seems to a lot of people like Herbert Hoover or even farther back. Like we're really past that stage. So Goldwater runs, he's very articulate. Reagan in that speech, "A Time for Choosing," is very articulate in outlining the principles of conservatism, but Goldwater gets trounced.
Yes.
Now Reagan, of course, as you say, goes on in the next couple of years to become governor of California, but it's not clear to me, at least, that Reagan's conservatism or Goldwater's conservatism immediately takes over the Republican Party. So what happens from when Reagan is governor and then on '60s and into the '70s? What's the Republican Party like? What's Reagan's relationship with the Republican Party? Because, of course, eventually he becomes the nominee of that party. That probably would have been surprising to a lot of people in 1964.
Yeah. And again, I personally think that Reagan, from the 1960s on, is one of the people who really has a clear vision of what conservatism is and should stand for. But with regard to the party, I wouldn't say he's an outcast, but he's an important figure. His prominence is growing within the party, especially as governor. But I think from the position of party leadership in the '70s, I was tempted to make the comparison to a B actor, right? Sort of, which would be a terrible attempt at humor. So, but he's a sort of B-level figure, but his prominence grows. And part of the reason Reagan's importance grows is that the problems that he identifies, the concerns that he identifies in 1964 become more and more true. His predictions about what we're going to become in 64 start to become reality. And all of a sudden, Reagan is recognized, all of a sudden, over the course of time in the 70s, by the late 70s especially, Reagan is recognized as sort of that voice in the wilderness that had been warning us that if we go down this path, this is what's going to happen. And so Reagan, I don't want to misrepresent Reagan as just the sort of person who's pointing out all the problems. Reagan had also been articulating a positive understanding of what conservatism stands for. Right? It's not simply conservatism is against this and we want to cut this and we want to cut this. Although there was a lot Reagan wanted to cut, but the cumulative effect of Reagan's insights into the path that we seem to have chosen in 1964 came pretty much to fruition as the economy became worse, foreign policy issues became worse and were raised to the level of crises, especially with Iran and Russia, the Soviets invading Afghanistan, and these sorts of things. People really started to notice that Reagan had been the guy who predicted that if we make the wrong decision in 1964, this is likely where we're to end up. We're likely to end up. And you add on top of that Reagan's concerns that government would continue to sprawl and grow, and we just would continue to increase spending. We would dig ourselves into a hole that we could not easily dig ourselves out of.
So he's a important figure in the Republican Party because he's the Republican governor of California from the late 60s through 70s. But he runs and to some extent, and Carter actually points this out in the debate transcript you had us read, that as a governor of California, he talked very conservatively. He didn't always exactly govern in the most conservative way. But of course, he had to deal with the legislature in California, and that always requires compromise, and governance always does. But he's obviously prominent enough by the time we get to 1976 that he mounts a challenge to the incumbent Republican president, Gerald Ford.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell us a little bit about why does Reagan choose to campaign against Ford, and what effect does that have?
Well, this is a great question, and it has a lot to do with Reagan's understanding of federalism. So Reagan is governor, by the way, and when Carter pointed out that Reagan governed as a kind of progressive on the state level as governor, he's not wrong. But that was not an unusual position to take. I mean, in that he was, say, for example, imitating Reagan's great, the person he admired very much, Calvin Coolidge, who as governor of Massachusetts had governed very progressively in a certain sense, but then as president tended to be much more conservative, if you will, right? So Reagan thought that on the state level, there's a lot that government can do, right? A lot more things that government can do, but that's on the state level. The state should be doing things that states ought to be responsible for. What Reagan was really opposed to was the federal government trying to do those things that states, including governors and state legislatures, ought to be looking out for as their first concerns, right? He was opposed to that, first of all, on constitutional grounds, and secondly, because he saw the waste and inefficiency that often happened when programs became federal in nature, right? So, Carter points out that Reagan, did this as governor of the state, and Reagan's response, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, is, yeah, I was governor of a state. I wasn't, I wasn't president of the United States, right? Or I wasn't Congress. Now, that's related to his opposition to Ford, who he saw as essentially having fallen into that mindset of liberalism, which assumed, in Reagan's understanding, that the federal government does things better, simply, right? So he identified Ford as essentially a Republican, but one who had bought into the idea of big federal government, wasn't willing to take a strong stand in terms of setting a limit to the sorts of things that the federal government was willing to do. And by the way, that's the same sort of problem that Reagan was dealing with back in 1964 as well. When you think about the kinds of people that came together initially as Republicans in 1964, the real issue in 1964, by the way, I mean, Reagan has his, frames the issue very nicely, right? In his mind, the issue is we have a choice to make between going down the road of greater, ever sprawling government, right? Increased government spending and government entitlement programs and government bureaucracies, and in which, how does he put it? A little intellectual elite in a far distant capital plans our lives for us, better than we can. Or we can return to an understanding of the relationship of government and individuals that is much more firmly rooted in the ideas and principles of the American founding. Um, the outcome of the election in 1964 really, though, was between, at least among liberals, was a question of do we go down the road of sort of great society liberalism, or do we remain sort of New Deal liberals, if you will, right? And great society liberalism won, and from that point forward, the trajectory was greater and greater government programs. Ford, in Reagan's mind, was sort of a soft liberal of sorts on the federal level, and so he did not have any problems opposing him on a matter of constitutional principle.
So he opposes him, and of course Ford's vice president, I think, is Rockefeller. So that's the Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party. So Ford is sort of in the center. Rockefeller's a little on the liberal side of the Republican Party. Then you've got Reagan, who's clearly by this time established as a national conservative figure.
Sure.
And I think I heard somewhere that Reagan gave up and got up and gave a speech to the 1976 Republican convention, and was followed by Ford. But Reagan got up and gave this speech, and after he sat down, a lot of people turned to each other and said, "We just nominated the wrong guy."
Well, that's right, exactly right. Yeah, why did we not nominate this guy? So, I mean, look, and part of the reason for that was, look, Reagan was very articulate, as we know. He was known as the great communicator. He had a knack for saying things in the right way that could just get across to people, right, in a sort of common sense way, with very few words sometimes, right? He was like Lincoln in that. He just knew exactly the right way to say things. And he was known for that. There's a reason they asked him to give this speech in 1964, right, in support of Barry Goldwater. But it took some time, right? Some of the things that Reagan was calling for were I don't want to say radically new. That's not quite the term. But look, old habits are hard to break, so to speak, right? And Republicans had essentially, and I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, most Republicans since the 1940s had essentially been moderate liberals in a certain sense. And so what Reagan is really trying to do is reform, renew. In fact, started what he laid the foundations for what he calls a new beginning, a new start, not just for America, but for the Republican Party. And that's going to take some time.
So some folks are one of our audience is interested to know, how did Reagan develop his ability to write and speak so well? Because one of the things we've noticed, the election of 1800 and Jefferson, of course Lincoln in 1860, and now Reagan, is one thing these defining elections have in common, the candidates, is Jefferson may not have been a great public speaker, but he was a great public writer, right? In fact, John Adams says that's why he was picked, even as a young man, to write the Declaration of Independence, because he had written other things that people love so much. There's no higher example of political poetry or just pure poetry in America than Abraham Lincoln's speeches, the Gettysburg Address, for example, right?
Right.
Beautiful. How did Reagan develop his ability to take complicated ideas, as you said, boil them down into common sense phrases, but then make that common sense phrase sound right and kind of sing? How did he do that? Because he was not a man of a very deep education, at least in his college career.
No, he was not. He was, excuse me. There are some parallels with Lincoln here. I mean, Reagan did come from a relatively poor background, low-income family in northern Illinois. So he was a man of the people before he became famous, as a Hollywood actor. And those sorts of people just have a kind of common sense way. I come from those people, as you know. We have a kind of common sense way of putting things. So having grown up, in the environment that he did, he would have been used to that way of thinking. Um, his education was not that great. He himself said that, right? In fact, he commented that one of the perks of being elected president is that you have your school transcripts classified, designated classified information. So, but Reagan read. Here, this is again interesting parallels with some of the other great statesmen in U.S. history, Lincoln, even Washington, right? Reagan read. He wasn't a deep reader. I can't say necessarily that he was reading treatises on politics and things like that, but he was familiar with the great speeches of Lincoln. We know that because in his speeches, which Reagan, by the way, had a big hand in writing, he had speechwriters, but Reagan would often draft his own speeches and then, give them to his speechwriters to edit, and then Reagan would re-edit the edits. But there are great references to Lincoln. There are great references to the founding fathers, many important documents. So we know that he read, and um, and it became that coupled with perhaps his acting career had some role in this as well. But he just was the sort of person who could speak plainly, plain common sense ideas. It's a real gift, and not everybody can do that, right? So, I mean, he just has this knack of putting certain ideas in front of him, in front of people. I was looking for a particular example here. I mean, this is poetic almost, as you say, right? In his speech to accepting the presidential nomination at the Republican convention in 1980, he says, "We are going to put an end to the notion that the American taxpayer exists to fund the federal government. The federal government exists to serve the American people." I mean, that's a perfectly nice, pithy statement, right? That just gets its way immediately into your mind. Yeah, the federal government exists. It's not the opposite, right? So he just had this knack. In the 1980 presidential debate, he had so many great lines and moments, right? Not only was he funny, but he just had, again, this knack of putting things out there for people to let sink in. At one point, Carter was going on President Carter at the debate in 1980 in Cleveland. Was going on about all the reasons that we're in dealing with the problems we're dealing with, right? OPEC, Iran, this and so on and so forth. And Reagan's response to this was, "Look, we don't have an inflation problem. We don't have inflation because the people are living too well," he says. "We have inflation because the government is living too well." I mean, just nice, clear, statements like that just burn their way into people's minds and memories. So he just had a real knack for this.
So he, as you say, had learned how to deliver a line. Obviously, as an actor, but that's interesting to me that he had done this kind of reading, and I think that people don't always know. As you were talking about the 1960s, that he was, I think, a spokesman for General Electric and went around and sort of honed his pitch and honed his ability to listen as he went around to various plants of General Electric and just talk to employees. Really interesting company program. To have Reagan go around and sort of listen to employees and sort of talk to them about America and American ideas and principles. But I think he said himself in his autobiography that those are places where he learned what words and phrases and sentences resonated with people.
Yes.
Regular, ordinary people who worked at the GE plants.
Yeah.
And that really helped him. It wasn't foreign to him because, you say, he was never an affected guy. He was a common sense, ordinary Midwestern character. But he learned and heard the words.
Yeah.
And you can see that, as you say, not only in his speeches but in the debates, because he has great one-liners. He has those and the great turns of phrases and jokes. It doesn't get him, but look, and as Gerald Ford said of himself in his wonderful self-deprecating way, well, what did the people expect? I'm a Ford, not a Lincoln, right?
That's perfect.
It's a great line. But so Ford is Ford, an honorable man who served well, but lost to Carter in '76.
Right.
And a lot of Republicans after that loss thought maybe Reagan was the guy.
Yes.
Maybe his ideas are a little too radical for us, his conservative ideas for the mainstream of the Republican Party at the time, which sort of is right there with Gerald Ford. But maybe he's the guy. Maybe he's the right one. What does Reagan do to lay the groundwork for his run in 1980? Because clearly, after the 1976 campaign and Ford's loss, Reagan probably is the presumptive frontrunner for the Republicans in 1980. But what does Reagan do between 76 and 80 to prepare for that campaign?
Well, I mentioned the radio spots that he did every day. So he kept himself, sort of in the public eye with reminders of his views on these sorts of things. By the way, you can read those radio addresses in a collection called Reagan in His Own Hand, because he wrote every word of these 15-minute or so radio spots. So so he continued to remain in sort of a national figure, or have a kind of national presence in articulating what he considered to be fundamental American ideas. Reagan, I know, worked sort of behind the scenes. He was talking with important figures in the Republican Party. He happened to be personal friends, as you know, with John Ashbrook, whose honor the center we work for is named. So I know that he was very involved with other members of the Republican Party who were also conservatives. And so I don't know that it was immediately clear, by the way, going into 1980, that Reagan was the front runner. There were some others on the ticket. Bob Dole was a very well-known name. I think the top three were Reagan, Dole, and Anderson. Anderson, of course, ended up running as an independent. But it became pretty clear early on, I believe, in the primaries in 1980, that Reagan was in fact the right person. Not only because he was a very personable person, a guy who genuinely loved people, and that came across clearly, but because he could articulate the ideas that had come to sort of really start to take root in the Republican Party, and also he seemed the right person for the job in terms of dealing with foreign policy issues. Here's a man of character who understood and had said repeatedly that the only way we can deal with the Soviets is from a position of strength and not from weakness. And so Reagan repeatedly demonstrated what his character would be like as president in the few years leading up to the election of 1980.
Yeah, and that's interesting. It's not one of the speeches you had us read, of course, but he gives a speech to the National Association of Evangelicals, I think, in 1983, where he famously calls the Soviet Union an evil empire.
Oh, yes.
Which of course, sent off shockwaves to people. I recall talking with someone, historian of that time, who said, and his speechwriters, he wrote that in himself. His speechwriters kept taking it out.
Yeah.
And he kept putting it back in, over their objections, because he said that's the moral clarity that we need to articulate to the world, and because he just thought it sounded right.
Yeah.
As a phrase.
Reagan was consistent in his condemnation of communism as evil. That was not the first time he had called it that, by the way, but it was the first time as a president had used that term to describe communism. Communism was fundamentally bad, evil, according to Reagan, because it was built on the fundamental assumption that human beings were actually incapable of being free, and as a result, the state thought of individuals not as individuals, but really as tools to be used for the purposes of the state, right? And I think that real hatred, if you will, of communism partly informed his concern over the course he saw Great Society liberalism taking the country. It wasn't communism as a sort of economic system, but the differences between Great Society liberalism, or socialism, if you will, and communism were differences of degree. That is, the Great Society liberalism put us on the course to greater and greater reliance on government programs, government assistance, and of course, Reagan understood that with every program that comes out of the federal government, there's always a catch, right? And the catch is a loss of greater freedom, the erosion of individual freedom, the erosion of individual opportunity to pursue happiness as they choose. And with that, by the way, came the erosion of progress in Reagan's mind, right? The more socialist or more communist, the more you rely on government for more and more things that you become, the less progress you're likely to make, because as Reagan says repeatedly, including in some of the documents for this evening, right? It's free enterprise. It's the freedom of the individual to go out and pursue happiness, to work for, whatever success is for them in life that leads to innovation. It leads to new and better ways of doing things, right? So the problem with any form of sort of government regimentation is that it erodes the very possibility of progress, real progress, in Reagan's mind. As he says at the end of his remarks at the debate in 1980 with President Carter, he says, I'm quoting him here, "I would like to have a crusade. I'd like to lead that crusade with your help, and it would be one to take government off the backs of the great people of this country and turn you loose once again to do those things that I know you can do so well because you did them and made this country great." So it's individuals, right, exercising their individual liberties and freedoms that have made this country great, not just for the individuals, but for the country itself, right? So
So those are, as you say, by the time we get to 1980, the Republican Party has sort of shifted toward those ideas, and Reagan becomes the nominee. But a number of people have been asking questions from our audience, really good ones. The role of ideas is clearly important, but there's also the role of Reagan, the person, in winning the nomination and then going up against Jimmy Carter. And you had us read some speeches from Jimmy Carter, his opponent there, President Carter. Yeah. Talk about a little bit about, what do we see in those speeches of Reagan, and maybe in contrast with Carter, about Reagan the person that enabled him to be politically successful?
Oh boy, that's a great question. Well, look, Reagan was funny. He was witty. He was quick. He seemed clear in his own mind about what he believed in, and that allowed him, I think, to be very articulate in the kinds of answers he would give to questions, or the kinds of ideas he would put out in response to to criticisms. He had a kind of affability about him that was genuine. People felt as though he really did like people, and he did. Apparently, he just liked people, right? He wasn't a disdainful, but he was an optimist. Reagan liked to think of himself as an optimist, and I can tell you, by the way, part of the reason I'm really happy you asked me to talk about this topic is this was actually 1980 was the first election I remember paying attention to as a kid. And I remember, at least hearing my parents and others in the family talking about these things. And what Reagan brought to the table that Carter didn't seem to be able to bring was a sense of real optimism and hope that, yes, things are bad, but if we restore in our minds a belief in the fundamental ideas that have made America great, we can not only get out of this, we can move on to greater and greater things, right? We can move on to greater prosperity, greater security, greater happiness, greater opportunity for all. So that he was an optimist, and I think that really came across in the way he spoke. So President Carter, I think, made a huge political blunder in giving this speech, which has come to be known as the malaise speech, even though Carter doesn't use the term malaise, right? He calls it a crisis of confidence. Carter, in fact, titled the speech, I think it was called the Speech on National Energy Policy. It was very quickly dubbed as the malaise speech. There's a reason people call it the malaise speech, even though he doesn't use the word malaise. It's depressing, right? Interestingly enough, Carter, one of his pollsters suggested to Carter that part of the problem among voters was that they were suffering this crisis of confidence after a series of setbacks, American setbacks, Vietnam, political assassinations, RFK, JFK, MLK, others, Watergate, and so Carter, gave this speech which had a very negative effect on his appearance in the eyes of the American people, because the message that people got from it was things are really, really bad, and they're going to get worse. and we just have to suck it up. And somehow, if we stick together, we can muddle through this. I mean, I'm really oversimplifying the message, right? And it did nothing to help Carter's image, right? As a guy who's just suffering as president, right? Feeling the pain of others, but he's suffering through the presidency, sort of not quite knowing what to do to make things better. Reagan, in his acceptance speech of the Republican nomination, responds to that directly. He says, "Look, we face a disintegrating economy, a weakened defense, and an energy policy based on the sharing of scarcity." They tell us, and this is almost a direct response to what Carter had said in that speech. They tell us that they have done the most that humanly could be done. Sorry. They say that the United States has had its day in the sun, that our nation has passed its zenith. They expect you to tell your children that the American people no longer will have to cope with their problems, that the future will be one of sacrifice and few opportunities. My fellow citizens, I utterly reject that view, right? And he goes on, he says, the American people, the most generous people on earth, who created the highest standard of living, are not going to accept the notion that we can only make a better world for others by moving backwards ourselves. I mean, so you can immediately hear the difference in tone, right? And Reagan had this, again, not just a knack to communicate clearly, but to inject this real feeling. And here was a guy, if anybody, who could help us think through the problems that we're facing and find real alternatives and solutions to those problems.
So some folks are wanting to know, and it's a really good question. And it's a big question, but let me ask it to you. Maybe it's unfair. Why does Reagan win in 1980? How much of it is it the right man at the right moment against the right opponent?
Yeah, it's both.
Or what is it?
No, I think it's both. Look, I mean, Carter was a trying not to be too hard on him. Carter was the wrong man for the office to deal with the kinds of real problems that he had to deal with.
Sorry, I have to interrupt because he's a Democrat. He invokes Franklin Roosevelt, but his disposition in office and the way he talks about crisis and that crisis of confidence speech is so contrary to someone like Franklin Roosevelt and how he talked about when the crisis was even deeper.
Yeah. Roosevelt, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, right? I mean, let's just suck it up and bully our way out of this, right? The Great Depression or World War II, whatever it was. Carter could not convey to the American people, generally speaking, a sense that he either had the ideas to get us out of the problem or even the character to get us out of the problem. He was viewed as weak, right? There was a lot of criticism, by the way, from both left and right, over his handling of foreign policy, his sort of ostrich head in the sand approach to letting the Soviets get away from things. His policy of détente was considered to be by many, if not most, a massive failure because for the sake of relaxing or normalizing relations with the Soviet Union, they were getting away with bloody murder in the 70s. And Reagan, on the other hand, was seeing what was going on and was saying, look, you cannot trust the Soviets to behave themselves if all you do is show them how weak you are, right? So it's a combination of Carter, I think, not being the right man for the job at the time, given the crises that he was dealing with. But on the other hand, Reagan had all the right qualities in that election in 1980 to show, and he did it. This is the thing. You can't just have the qualities. You've got to be able to show the American people that you have those qualities, right? To deal with these things in a very hard but tough way, right? Because they have to be dealt with. We cannot continue to bury our heads in the sand and hope that the Iranians release the American hostages or that the Soviets somehow say, oops, our mistake, and they withdraw from Afghanistan, right? Or all these other sorts of things. So it's a great question, but I think it's a combination of both. Look, Carter, I'm trying not to be too ungenerous to Carter here. Carter would have made a good technocrat of sorts. I mean, he was, give Carter if things could be done just by establishing policy and then following through on the policy, great. Could be perfectly good at that. But Carter didn't seem to have anything new, new ideas, new ways of thinking, new ways of talking about what we can do to really fix things in America. Reagan brought that. Reagan really did bring that to the table. And I think that was the tipping point for him.
So how much of a role, you mentioned already the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1980, which seems like a setback for Carter's foreign policy. Obviously the Iran hostages. I think a lot of us who were around then, even me as a young teenager, remembers that was obviously a disaster politically for Carter. How much of a role did foreign policy play? And in particular, because it takes up a lot of space in the debate transcript that you had us look at, a lot of it, particularly the Cold War and what's the right approach to the Soviet Union. And Carter says something really interesting to me. He says that Reagan's understanding of the Soviet Union and his approach to the Soviet Union is a departure from his predecessors, both Democrat and Republican.
Right.
So could you talk about how Reagan understood in the election of 1980, how he understood the Soviet Union, Soviet communism, and what approach he articulated to it? How is that different from how other people were talking about it?
Yeah. So again, foreign policy, national security, Cold War stuff is one of the three big things that Reagan really hammers on in this election, right? So out of control spending, sprawling government, and mismanagement of the Cold War. Those are the big three things that he really focuses on. In Reagan's mind, Carter, Ford, and Nixon had all mismanaged Cold War foreign policy strategy. In part because they had adopted this policy of détente, right? I don't want to get too technical here, but we all know that détente was meant to, bring about some sort of relaxation of things. But really what it was meant to do was normalize relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. By the time Carter took office, Reagan described détente as essentially appeasement, right? We'll give you anything you want. We'll basically bend over backwards for you as long as you don't, misbehave, Soviet Union. That was the way Reagan liked to characterize Carter's use of détente, and also Ford's and Nixon's, by the way. Reagan believed that détente was moving us backwards. It was going to unravel or unroll any of the progress perhaps that we had made in showing the Soviets that we were serious about not only containing the expansion of communism, but possibly even rolling it back, right?
And that seems to me to be really important, right? Because you have three approaches to the Soviet Union that you outlined there. Détente, like let's get rid of the tension as much as possible. And then you have the sort of Harry Truman approach, which is let's recognize that there's a fundamental tension between the Soviet communism and America, but our goal is to contain it, keep it where it is. But then you have some people like Reagan who say containment's not enough. Our goal has to be roll back the progress of communism.
Yeah,
is that the way in which he sort of is more aggressive and sort of breaks with the foreign policy establishment?
Yeah, absolutely. And Reagan really does break from the sort of 30 plus years of containment thinking, right? Even as it was established by George Kennan, way back in 47, 48, right? This idea of containing was the ultimate goal. And the ultimate goal of containment had always been to, if we can contain it long enough, sooner or later, the Soviet Union will come around and sort of see that they have more to gain from cooperating with the West and the United States than by constantly trying to agitate and cause trouble and expand and so on and so forth. And eventually we'll reach the point at which we have normalized relations. But the problem with that view of containment was it assumed an end in which the Soviet Union was a permanent facet of the international landscape. And Reagan rejected that. Reagan saw the benefits of containment as it had been employed in certain ways, especially under Truman, the previous 30-some years of the Cold War. But Reagan thought that there's absolutely no reason we have to accept the fact that the Soviet Union is here to stay. Why do we assume that that's true?
Isn't that an incredibly radical idea and thing to say out loud?
And a lot of people found that to be dangerous. Hence, you saw, Reagan described as a warmonger. He's the guy that's going to get us all killed. There were, I remember a music video by a band I actually like, showing Reagan as a sort of puppet cartoon character sort of thing who having nightmares and would roll over and hit the red button, the nuclear button, in the middle of the night and get us all killed. So yeah, he was the guy who was going to lead us into an actual shooting war with the Soviet Union, a nuclear war, right, in the minds of a lot of people, because the language he used, first of all, by calling the Soviet Union evil, right, an evil empire, but also by saying, no, we can actually eliminate the Soviet Union if we play our cards right. A lot of people thought that was too radical of a departure. It was going to upset this balance that had sort of been established through détente, and it was just going to, make the Soviet Union more aggressive. So Reagan saw things that others didn't see, by the way. And what Reagan did was he matched. He said, let's match the economy of the free world, and especially the free economy, the right of the United States, against the communist economy of the Soviet Union. Let's see which wins. Let's see which one can produce, the kinds of goods and services that not only the people need, but what it takes to last out this Cold War and become a permanent fixture of the international landscape.
So I've got a really interesting question here from another great one from our audience, and that is, it's a question that says, asking, what would you say comparing FDR taking over from Hoover is similar to Reagan taking over from Carter? And in other words, it's revolution. And it even makes me think about what Barack Obama had to say about Reagan. You would think Barack Obama, who is a progressive Democrat, wouldn't have very nice things to say about Ronald Reagan. But in Obama's speeches and even in his book, he actually says, no, give Reagan credit. He realigned the country politically. And he and FDR are the two presidents of the 20th century who really did that. And of course, Obama wants to go back to FDR and roll back the Reagan Revolution, but he gives Reagan credit for that. So would you say, in fact, that Reagan's, is Reagan's election in 1980 the result of a revolution that's been happening, or is it the cause of a further revolution, or is that the right way to think about it? Is it a big event like FDR taking over from Hoover?
Oh yeah, certainly it is. I think it is a revolution of sorts. Again, a revolution meaning turning from one thing to another. It had the effect of I don't know if I want to say transforming, but maybe reminding Americans of who they are, who they were, what their fundamental principles were, right? What the fundamental American ideas that had informed, what Thomas Jefferson called the American mind for centuries, that allowed this country to be truly great in terms of the opportunities it provided for individuals. So in terms of the effect of influencing how people think and reminding Americans of what America traditionally had stood for and aimed at, it was a big transformation that took place. Again, it took place slowly in some ways over the course of 1964 to 1980, but by 1980, when Reagan really gets the national spotlight, he puts those ideas, those fundamental principles, the fundamental ideas, his fundamental vision of what America is, he puts that front and center in his speeches, and now has a national platform to do so. And that's another important thing to keep in mind with Reagan. One of his other, I think, great contributions is he revives in American political discourse the importance of thinking about the American founding and our fundamental ideas, the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. Really, for the first time since Calvin Coolidge, Reagan is the first president to really put the ideas of the American founding front and center in his political speeches. Other presidents had done that. Even Jimmy Carter, here and there says, let's let's not forget the founding and blah blah blah. But it's all sort of vague and squishy. Reagan really emphasizes that, and that has the effect, I think, of getting Americans to remember who they are and where they've come from and what they really stand for, as Reagan understood those things as well.
Is that why Reagan was so fond, as you said, of Lincoln and of Jefferson? Because it seems like what we've seen from the other two webinars in those elections, both Jefferson and Lincoln also believed that that there's a kind of natural small r Republican majority, that their elections were really restoring, that had sort of gotten out of whack or gotten lost, that was really rooted in in the hearts and minds of the American people and their attachment to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, which they might have forgotten or misunderstood for a while, but they saw it as their job to kind of restore Americans' understanding of those. Is that one of the reasons you think why Reagan was so attracted to Jefferson and Lincoln?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think he makes reference to that idea in his Time for Choosing speech in 1964. After he talks about the problem of sprawling government and the increase in numbers in terms of federal bureaucracies and so on and so forth, he says, "Look, somewhere, Reagan says, a perversion has taken place." He uses the word perversion, right, which means things have been switched in terms of order or something, right? A perversion has taken place somewhere. Our natural inalienable rights are now considered to be a dispensation of government. And freedom has never been so fragile, he says, so close to slipping from our grasp as it is at this moment. So what Reagan wants to do is correct that perversion, or maybe that inversion of how we think about things, right? Rights don't come from government. Rights are natural, they're inalienable, they're inherent in human beings. And that's a very fundamental belief that Reagan held, and he wanted to remind Americans of what Reagan considered to be that fundamental truth. So I do see some great parallels, as you're pointing out, with what Lincoln saw himself doing, for example. So,
and then Reagan's, you've mentioned it already a little bit, but a number of folks have asked, again, more about Reagan's character on the campaign trail. He's funny.
He's hilarious.
In a way that perhaps Jimmy Carter is not so funny.
Yeah, right. No, that's the other great thing. I mean, Jimmy Carter was, he before Bill Clinton said, "I feel your pain," Jimmy Carter said, "I feel your pain." So, Carter came across as a guy who could commiserate with you. But again, I'm beating up on Carter a little bit here. I feel like if you were to go to a bar and have a beer with Carter, all you do is complain, or talk about each other's troubles the whole time. But Reagan was funny. He was lively. He was witty. Even at the debate, the televised debate, Reagan was constantly making the audience laugh. At one point, Barbara Walters had asked President Carter, she asked him a question about, I think it had to do with energy policy, and Carter sort of gave an answer, and then Walters rephrased the question and asked him again, and Carter said some more things, and Reagan interjected and said, "Barbara, you've asked him the same question twice. I think you deserve at least one answer. May I please?" Just little things like that, and the audience would erupt with laughter, right? Reagan was witty, he was funny. There's so many great stories about Reagan. I remember the story of, when he was governor in California, he was dealing with the student protests at Berkeley, which got very ugly and violent. And Reagan actually went to, I think he was coming out of the Capitol, and there were a number of student protesters, waving signs and things like this. And Reagan got into his car. He was being driven, of course, as governor, and a number of students mobbed the car and were shoving signs and hitting the windows with these signs that said, "We are the future, we are the future." And so Reagan very quickly grabbed a piece of paper and wrote something and held it up on the window, and it said, "God help us all." He's just quick like that. So one of the best lines Reagan had during the election was how did he put it? I'm trying to remember the exact wording. A recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose your job. And recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his job. Right? So these great lines. And again, this is connected to Reagan's ability to not only say things that are funny and witty and humorous, but also in a sort of down-to-earth way that gets the point across. He would occasionally tell the story about this little community he said he knew of, this little town that decided they wanted to, they had passed a law, and they wanted to raise their street signs from 5 feet to 7 feet for safety purposes and visibility rights. So the street signs, they wanted to raise 2 feet. And somebody from the federal government shows up and says, "We have a program to do that already. Only under our program, we just lower the streets 2 feet." So, again, Reagan had this knack of pointing the absurdity of some of these government programs out in a way that was both common sense and extremely funny. So,
Wow. Chris, that's wonderful. Thank you. There's so many interesting aspects to this election. Thank you so much for just spending some time with us, having conversation. Boy, as I always say, the time has gone quickly, and it certainly has. Thank you so much for joining us and having a conversation with me, Chris. And I want to thank everybody else, you all out there, for joining us, especially thanks to the teachers who are joining us through our Teaching American History program. Chris mentioned that a time for choosing Reagan's speech. It's one of many speeches that I just want to highlight in this book here, 50 Core American Documents. It's actually done by Professor Burkett. It's a wonderful resource for you, for your children, for your grandchildren, and for your students. It's available from the Ashbrook Center, ashbrook.org. You can find that there. It's filled with lots of primary source documents from the founding period all the way well into the 20th century. Wonderfully edited and excerpted by Professor Burkett. It's just must reading for students and teachers and citizens. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to being with you again. I want to thank again Missouri Humanities for their partnership with us in this event. Missouri Humanities offers a number of programs, and I just encourage you to really check those out. Free virtual opportunities to learn about Native American, German, and Civil War heritage throughout the upcoming year. So please visit MissouriHumanities.org to connect to the people, places, and events that shape society. And again, I want to thank them for their generous partnership. Learn more about the Ashbrook Center, please. We'd love to have you do that at ashbrook.org. For resources, teachingamericanhistory.org, TAH.org. If you want to listen to this again, or you'd like to send this, as with the other webinars, we'll be sending you a link to a recording of today's webinar, so you can go and listen to this again if you missed something, or send it on to your friends, your family, your children, your grandchildren. We love it to have it shared as far and wide as possible. So thank you again for joining us. I hope we've got an insight into these really important elections, and sort of the idea that they show us that these pivotal elections really go back to reminding the American people of fundamental principles and renewing our own understanding of those principles. As undoubtedly we'll have that political debate this year in 2020, I hope this series has given you some insight and some historical perspective on that debate. Thank you for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thanks again for listening. You can learn more about our free webinars and resources for teachers of American history, government, and civics at teachingamericanhistory.org or simply tah.org.